Sponsored by Taylor Freelance, Rainier Ballistics, Hodgson Powders, and JPL Precision.
Hey Firefighter fans, I'm Rick, and we did an entire episode on IDPA Safety Officer training, and it was just sort of like an overview of who should do it, why you should do it, the requirements, the requirements of you while you're serving as a safety officer. But what we didn't get into was the process of becoming a safety officer. When the new rulebook came out, actually I think it was the last rulebook revision in 2013, they started down the road of coming up with some consistent requirements for safety officer candidacy. And I mentioned in a prior episode that at my club, we have 3 safety officer instructors at my club, and for a long time, still I think we're the only safety officers instructors in the state. And what we would do to help ensure the success of our safety officer classes is we would essentially decide amongst ourselves whether somebody was a suitable candidate or not. We didn't have a list of requirements. Headquarters did not say you have to be this, this, and this, and have this and that amount of experience. But we just had a general sense after shooting for 10 years, 15 years, that this guy, he's a go-getter, he's smart, he's on the ball, he's interested. When given the opportunity, he'll take the timer, even though he's not a registered safety officer, and so a certified safety officer. And then there'll be other people who you can just tell by looking at them. They're kind of the shrinking violet. They don't have a command presence. You could see them being run over by an aggressive shooter who questioned there's a scoring decision or whatever. Other shooters are gung-ho, but they have very little experience. They've only been shooting for they've only shot a handful of matches, and they love it and they really like it, and they now, hey, I want to get involved and be a safety officer. But if you've only shot a handful of matches, I think your awareness of the sport and some of the nuances of it aren't quite developed yet. And so anyway, we had devised amongst ourselves this kind of just an unspoken agreement about this is the kind of guy or gal who's going to be a good safety officer, and this person maybe not so much. And we weeded out people before they took the class, suggesting, hey, shoot more matches, build more experience, in general, shoot for a year or more before you take the class. So it'll be better for you and better for us, kind of a thing. But when the new, I think it was the 2013 rules came out, headquarters started down the path of let's come up with a way to kind of screen people to see who's qualified before they get into the class. And so I think that was a big step forward. It makes the safety officer job safety officer instructor job a little more involved, because you have to contact people well in advance of the class, months in advance of the class. It used to be we would schedule a class just by, at the shooters meeting at a match saying, hey, we're going to have a safety officer class a month from tomorrow. Send me an email if you want to go, kind of thing, to now, 90 days before the class, send out this form, and 60 days before the class, send out this form, and inform everybody that there's a link to a test on this date, and it's made it a little more difficult, but at the same time, you can kind of make a schedule for yourself. I mean, I literally mark on my calendar, send out the application questionnaire, put a circle on it, and then 3 weeks later, send out the link to the pretest, and so for somebody who's organized, the new program includes send this out no later than 3 weeks before the class. Do this no later than 10 days before the class. And so it's set out there for you to follow if you're an organized enough person to follow it. And so, for instance, one of the nice things, we made one of these for ourselves, our own use, and now headquarters has made it, and it's essentially just a questionnaire asking the shooter, what's your level of experience? How many matches have you shot? Are you do you have any certification as an instructor of any kind? And so you get even if it's a shooter you've never met, you get a good idea of their level of experience. What's your classification? And so this is the kind of your first contact with the safety officer candidates. And when you get these back, I'll go through them with a red pen and say, okay, this guy hasn't shot it. I don't think this guy's shot enough matches, or I can't read this guy's email. I mean, whatever it is, it's all this is it's a pretty valuable document to have, and it just lets you know, gives you an idea of who's qualified for the class. And also, we're going to try to have, since there has been no safety officer training for a couple of years, I'm trying to promise people, we're going to have 15 candidates in our first class in February, our first class we've had in a couple of years, and then I promise people we're going to have another class. So if you can't make the February 27th class, we will have another class later in the spring. Now, the class that we're teaching here in February is kind of in the general greater Seattle area. And so the vast majority of shooters live in the greater Seattle area. So the central location is going to be really good, but we also have shooters that are way down in the southern end of Puget Sound, shooters up closer to the Canadian border. And so I've said we will have another class, and it's not going to be here in the central part of the state, but the two locations that I've been offered are like an hour north of downtown Seattle and 2 hours south of downtown Seattle. So obviously, if there's a guy up in the Canadian border who doesn't want to come down as far as Seattle, he's sure as heck not going to want to drive an additional 2 hours down to Firearms Academy of Seattle for the class down there. So what we may end up doing is having 3 classes, and that's up to the safety officer instructor to decide, where do I need my classes? And so it's very possible we're going to have 3 classes in the next 3 months, one way up north for the people that's convenient for them, one here in the central and one area in the south. But try to, if you're an instructor or you're a student, just be aware that it requires quite a little bit of planning on the part of the instructors, and making it easier on everybody either to have the class in a geographical location that's handy to a large number of people, or being able to accommodate the class location wherever it is. It's a kind of a two-way street. So the initial questionnaire goes out. It gives the safety officer instructor a chance to kind of review everybody's credentials and decide, are they ready or not? The second part is that anybody who gets as far as getting that initial application has already been recommended to the instructor by the club contact that the candidate belongs to. So if I get an inquiry from someone saying, hey, I want safety officer training, the first thing I'm going to do is go to the person who runs the matches that person most often attends and says, hey, what's your opinion of this person? Are they a good candidate? Are they savvy? Do they understand the rules? Are they motivated? And again, just because you're smart and you understand the rules and you have willingness, there's also, again, you're in charge when you're the safety officer. And so I also do kind of look for this, a personality type that, if I've made a call and I'm convinced that it's the right call, you're not going to convince me otherwise. I mean, it's not supposed to be adversarial, but you have to have that air of confidence that you project, that shooters will respect. And so if I get a club contact that says, oh yeah, he's been shooting here for 2 years, I highly recommend him, I will often put that ahead of what's on this, because I think this gives you an insight into the kind of the person's history, but I want to see somebody who's actually been on the range with that person say, oh yeah, this is a guy. And most of the club contacts, I know all of them. I don't know every shooter at every club. We have 6 clubs here in the Puget Sound area, so I'm likely to know every one of the guys who's a club contact, but I can't know every shooter guy or gal, who shows up at their matches. So that's nice. So after we've kind of done this pre-selection of candidates, then the next step is there's a link to an online pre-test. And if you've ever taken an online test, it's generally, you'll get, here's the question, and you generally will have a choice of answers. I've never actually taken that test because, of course, it's just been implemented in the last couple of years. But it's fairly concise. It doesn't take a whole lot of time. And at the end, you get a certificate that, yes, you passed your safety officer pre-test, and you're supposed to send that to the instructor. And I've often allowed shooters to just bring the certificate to the class. If it's a hassle, you're supposed to have that certificate, in hand when I arrive, for the class. But sometimes the scheduling, somebody's been out of town or something, and so you just kind of work with each other. Send that certificate if you can, or bring it to the class with the safety officer instructor's approval. So then now you've filled out your application, you've gotten the approval from your club contact, you've taken the online pre-test. if you've gotten through all that, you should be a pretty good candidate. I mean, that kind of weeds out anybody who is either not interested enough to take the test, not interested enough to pass the test. So it does kind of work to weed out the people who might not really be up to it. But it's not difficult. It's not. They're not holding you to an extremely high standard. So that's what the class is for. I mean, if you're unable to enforce the rules, unable to consistently put yourself in the right position, coordinate with your scorekeeping safety officer, et cetera, that'll all come out in the class. And the class has changed quite a bit since the pre-2013 era. It used to be the safety officer class was an entire day in the classroom, 8 or 9 hours in the classroom, essentially reading through the rule book page by page. The producer likened it to belonging to a book club. But if you're familiar at all with the rules, there's probably only about 10% of them that on a given match day you actually have to have memorized and be able to immediately recall. You have to be able to judge cover, understand what cover is. You have to be able to score a target, whether it's limited or unlimited. There's those kind of things. But then when it comes to a little more, the rule book is also full of stuff about say how to accommodate disabled shooters. There's quite a bit of that in there, and now they've added a complete section in there about appealing scores, things like that. It has to be in the rule book, but you don't have to memorize it, And so the class session has been whittled down from 8 or 9 hours to about 4 hours. And the emphasis on the class now is actually being a safety officer. And how do you do it? You spend twice as much time out on the range as you used to, and half as much time in the classroom. There's not this, just like rote memorization of every rule in the book. That's no longer expected. The emphasis on the class now is being a safety officer, performing the safety officer function on match day. That's the emphasis, and rightly so. I mean, that's the especially now that it used to be when we would run our matches, the safety officer had the timer, he was watching the gun, he was checking for cover, he's scoring the targets. It's essentially a one-man show. And the new rules emphasize the chief safety officer, the primary safety officer, as coordinating with the scoring safety officer, so that the guy with the timer, his primary function is watching the gun, watching the shooter's finger, watching the muzzle direction. And the scorekeeper's job now is heavily involved in the judging cover. So if a shooter goes into an unusual shooting position that would put me out of position to see the gun or the gun hand, I should stay where I can see the gun, and then the scorekeeper should be over here in position to judge cover. So a lot of what we're doing in the safety officer class is building this teamwork between the primary, PSO, SSO, so that they're coordinating their movement so that neither one of them gets in the way of the shooter, and they don't get in each other's way, and there's always somebody in a position to judge cover, engagement order, and those rules, while the primary safety officer keeps their eye on the gun and the gun hand. So that's essentially the nuts and bolts of it. If you're interested in safety officer training, obviously contact your club contact, the person at your club who's listed on the IDPA headquarters website as being the club contact. They should be able to contact the closest safety officer instructor. For instance, my class is being taught here near Seattle, but I'm having a couple of guys that are coming up from Oregon to attend the class. So depending on where you are, your safety officer instructor and your classes might be very accessible, or they might be more distant. I'm also aware of another class that's going to be held out in the eastern part of the state in Spokane, but it sounds like the guys who run the club live in Spokane, Washington, but the range where they shoot is actually across the border in Idaho. So at this point, I'm not sure if I'm going to fly out there to teach the class, or if Ken Reed in Idaho is going to get somebody who's, I don't know if they're geographically closer or more convenient, but anyway, find out from your locals where the classes are going to be, when they're going to be, and hopefully there'll be one that is not too far away. But that's it. If you're interested, in any more details, you can go ahead and contact the show. I'll provide, whatever information I have on it. But if you're interested in it in your area, contact your club contact. They should know who the safety officer instructors are and get you pointed in the right direction. Hey Power Factor fans, it's Rick. I've got another little cool kind of historical functional story for you. I love my storytelling. And one of the long-lasting stories that maybe is a myth, I don't know, is that the original M1911 pistol could be completely disassembled without any tools. And I think I've mentioned it on previous episodes, that if you have your pistol, here's an example. I'm going to bring this out for two reasons. This is another little quick look at the camera hammer. When we did the initial episode, I displayed the hammer installed in the gun, but I hadn't yet come up with a grip safety, wasn't sure the thumb safety that was on the gun originally would work, and it did. So this is an old, what Colt shooters call a rat tail. It's a GI style grip safety that's had a little recess put in the top so that the hammer can fit down into it. And so that was great. And then just coincidentally, the thumb safety that worked with the other hammer also works with this one. Anytime you change the hammer or the sear, it can change the relationship of the internal parts enough that the safety won't fit. And it's pretty tight, but it's functional. So we'll get this to the range and test the camera hammer. But I wanted to use this as an example of the idea that you can take the gun apart without any tools. Now, the reason that the gun is its own toolkit is that what you need to take it apart is a couple of punches, pins, and a screwdriver. Now, the screwdriver is kind of an interesting story in that the way I heard it is the original screws, if you look at them, the grip screws, the bottom of the screw slot is not flat. It's shaped like this. It's a semicircular radius in the bottom of the slot. And the reason for that is so that you could use the rim of a 45 auto case as your screwdriver to take the grip screws off. Now, another story I heard is that, they didn't intend you to use the case, they intended you to use the toe of the magazine base plate. So if you look at this, it is about the same radius as the spent 45 case. Now, I think the base plate is a little too thick to use as a screwdriver. The slot width has varied over the years. Some commercial screws are much wider or much narrower than others. But either way, if you need to get the grips off, you should be able to use either the toe of the magazine base pad or a rim of a 45 auto cartridge. Now, the other story I've heard is that if you're having trouble getting the bushing off of your gun, the radius on this toe is about the same as the radius on the recoil spring plunger. So if I wanted to try to get my gun apart and I needed a little help, I can use the toe of the magazine to depress the plunger and use the magazine as a bit of a tool to get that bushing out. Then you can get the slide off, of course, without using any tools. So now you've got your upper and your lower. You've used your magazine as a bushing wrench to get the bushing off so you can get the barrel out. But then at the other end, we have the firing pin. Now, as you progress through your disassembly, you do need a pin. And most of the stories that I've heard involving this kind of, the 1911 is its own toolbox, you're using the firing pin to punch out the mainspring housing pin, the hammer pin, and the sear pin. But how do you get the firing pin out? You need something to depress the firing pin into the tunnel to allow the firing pin stop to slip out. So for instance, here I've got here's the firing pin, and we've got to depress that. Now if I have my firing pin already out of the gun, of course, I can use that as a tool to depress the firing pin and remove it. But if I don't have this, what is the tool? What is the implement that I'm using to compress the firing pin? I don't know. that's part of it still kind of a mystery to me. And the producer and I were discussing it before the show. Well, maybe you could use like the tip of the recoil spring, or maybe you could, I suggested, well, what if you use there's probably a loose end on the magazine spring, but of course you need a pin of some type, unless you can wiggle the follower out of the magazine with your fingers, you need a tool to get the magazine apart. So I'm not so sure. We should maybe make this a trivia question. What tool are you using to get the firing pin out so that you can then use the firing pin as a tool? So of course the remaining pins are going to be the hammer pin and the sear pin. Here's the sear pin being used to retain the safety on this side. Here's the hammer pin. Well, it's actually hidden. The hammer pin is actually hidden behind you can't quite see it. But anyway, the hammer pin is behind this safety. So once you get the safety out, you need a pin to push out the hammer pin and the sear pin. And then once you get the mainspring housing out, you can use the sear spring as a screwdriver to remove the firing pin lock. And you're then pretty well disassembled. But then I heard a story the other day that when the M16, what started out as the Armalite AR-15 was being designed, that they intended that the M16 firing pin could be used as a 1911 takedown tool. Of course, in the late 50s, when the AR series rifles were being designed, the M1911A1 was still the standard pistol of the U.S. military, and the ARs were mostly all designed for military use. Armalite had a kind of an interesting business model in that they never really intended to be a manufacturer of guns. They would design and prototype guns, get foreign governments or local governments interested in the design, and then sell the production rights. And so that's why there are very few rifles that were made by Armalite. They designed a ton of guns. Up through, we're mostly familiar with the AR-10, which is the 308 version kind of the general AR style. AR-10 and AR-15 had a similar style. The AR-10, of course, came first. The AR-15 was actually shrunk down for the 223 cartridge, or actually I think the 222 cartridge originally. But the idea was that they would sell the guns to governments that were interested in buying them, and they designed the M16 firing pin with in mind the idea that it would be available as a takedown tool for the 1911 pistol. So here's our M16 firing pin next to our AR firing pin, and of course you really only need the tip to be small enough for the smallest pin, and the rest of it, as long as it's not too big for the smallest pin, it's a perfectly reasonable tool. And one of the things that's interesting too is when I'm casting about trying to think, well, how the heck do I get the firing pin out of my 1911? You can get the firing pin out of your AR without any tools. I shot my AR last weekend, and once you get the bolt carrier group out, get the bolt out, you have the firing pin available. So here's your M16 or AR-15 firing pin, and you can use this firing pin to get the firing pin out of your 1911 and go to town. So I guess that answers my question. If I'm out in the jungle with my M4 and my M1911A1 and I need to get the pistol apart, I take apart the bolt carrier group, get the firing pin out, and then that helps me take the 1911 apart. Now, another interesting thing that I've pondered, is that a lot of the modernization, improvement of the M1911 design over the years, depending on what it is you're trying to do with the gun, it can be an improvement. For instance, you want to shoot small groups, tightening up the tolerances and hand fitting everything, can improve the group size, and you can put a big mag weld on it to make the reloading easier. But one of the things is there's been a tendency to replace slotted screws with Allen screws. So now this gun, you can see I've got Allen grip screws on it, but I've also seen 1911 style pistols with Allen head mag catch lock, and then if you've got a two-piece guide rod, you've got an Allen head You need an Allen key to get the guide rod apart. So now, to get your gun apart, you don't just have to worry about a firing pin. You need at least 3 Allen keys to get your gun apart. So if you're out in the boonies and you need a kit of parts, you can reduce your maintenance kit considerably by not changing your grip screws and those other parts to Allen keys, to requiring Allen keys. I remember I was at SHOT Show a few years ago, and a guy was selling grips that had been inlet on the back side to hold an Allen key. So if you held the gun up and looked at the base, you could see the Allen key at the bottom. And if you could then pull that out and use it to take the grips off. So I thought you could take that one step further. The grips are thick enough that you could probably inlet the back of one of the panels to hold all 3 sizes of Allen key that you need. Then once you get one grip panel off, that gives you access to the other Allen keys. And you could put anything in there. I mean, you see ARs that have the aftermarket grips, pistol grips that are open at the bottom, so you can put a spare bolt in there, or 3 extra rounds, or batteries for your optic, or whatever fit into the pistol grip. On a 1911, there's a limited amount of space. The grips are 1/4 of an inch thick. So if you wanted to carry, again, some minor tools, even some spare parts, you could inlet all that into the back of the grip panel, and then as soon as you put those grips on the gun, that retains them on the gun, and then you just need the one easily accessible Allen key to get that grip off, and that gives you access to the tools and spare parts or whatever that you've stuck on the back there. So that's just an idea, again, of being able to take your toolkit with you where you go.